Welcome everyone to another FONS webinar. And this is a continuation, if you like, from the previous webinar we had where Len shared a group of eminent survey statisticians and users of what we thought were going to be continuing census data. That's up for debate at the moment. But on behalf of the FONS committee, thank you for joining this webinar. And the process is that Len will chair it, and he's got a plan. And so once again, welcome on behalf of the FONS committee. Len, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Tēnā koutou katoa, koutou mehi nui ki koutou ka hui mai o tēnei wā. Nō tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much. This is an illustrious panel, I must admit, one that a normal government statistician will be absolutely delighted to be discussing an interesting statistical issue with, and I hope that offer is taken up by all of you to any future government statistician. The central thrust of this talk really is about three words: fitness for purpose. And it's about the issues of methodology, but also what we do with the information. And I make that point because my economist friends would describe official statistics and population statistics in particular as having an unrealized asset value. And that comes from two reasons. The people that produce them have very little knowledge of how they're used generally, and the producers of them and the users of them are generally often quite poor at getting across what they do with them. And as a consequence, the decisions that are made politically about them really don't reflect the true value to society of what's being produced. In some ways, if you think about it now in the next 20 years, what are we going to be informing? Well, Treasury tells us we've got a fiscal gap of about 35% in the income we've got that's going to come from tax versus what we're doing. So basically, if those figures are correct, and who would doubt our Treasury, then the basic welfare state of New Zealand is going to have to be fundamentally transformed, or our tax system. We know that issues of environment, climate change, infrastructure, investment, 200 billion, energy, emergency management, and environmental health are important. The interesting thing is, when you look at the paper that the government statistician released in July, along with the ministerial decisions, the paper was called Modernising Our Approach, Summary of Customer and Community Engagement. Those words do not even appear in the paper. If you search for words, you won't find environment, climate. You find infrastructure 9 times, and it's talking about statistical infrastructure. Emergency isn't. And so basically, I think what our friends in stats are telling us, they have not actually looked at what people do with the information that we produce. And that, of course, is amplified by the fact that 10 years ago, the government statistician at the time got rid of all the expert advisory committees in economics and population. So we haven't really had that gutsy interaction. And why this forum is really important, I would argue it should have occurred before the government statistician made a decision in principle in October, and definitely before he told us that he had made that decision in July this year, that such a decision had been made. So I guess I want to make that point that in a way, there's a risk that in these decisions we've made, we're sort of flying blind and having given up the type of interaction that's fundamentally inherent in a statistical system. Also, I think a stats office is not only a data warehouse, which we're busily becoming, but it's also a window in society, so it has to report on it. It's interesting that it's the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment who's been advising Cabinet that we need to lift our game on geospatial frames in New Zealand. Neither the government statistician nor the Surveyor General, who would be the normal bodies for that, have actually taken any action so far. And I haven't found a document that refers to the words geospatial yet. Just searching alphabetically is an interesting thing. I think in a more scientifically minded government, these issues would have preceded what's actually being done. If I comment a little bit on the thing which I think I've done a little bit, is one of the arguments, apart from cost and the ability to run a census, which we discussed in our previous webinar, which we demonstrated we really don't have the information we need. One of the arguments was that the English are doing it, everyone else is doing it, and therefore we should do it. Well, in fact, the Australians, the British, the Americans, and the Canadians are all maintaining a place-based frame and lifting their game by using other information, not only the administrative records of the Crown, to improve their capacity to have a decent area-based frame, and also to complement the information that they actually obtain from the respondents to the surveys. They are not moving to a person-based frame of the sort that we see in those countries with population registers. I was recently in Britain and discovered that the events of the Royal Statistical Society at the end of January, which completely changed the view of the previous national statistician in Britain, that the 2031 British census would look a bit like ours is going to be. Well, that discussion, and the British, as you know, have a rather vociferous community, I can assure you of that. What they ended up with is basically turning over the whole idea. The British government in 2031 are going to have a census on a similar model to the ones they've had since 1841. The British National Statistician has left the job. The head of the British Statistical Authority, the UK Statistical Authority, is no longer there, are several other members. The British Parliament, if you look at the web, has completely done over the British statistical system in a way that really last happened in the 80s. And so the British statistical system is really going right back to what it did, and it's realizing that even in Britain they have to lift their game in engaging with users, and they're also aware that the issue of place-based statistics are going to become more important. So I just wanted to make that point that we are actually quite isolated in New Zealand, but we're also isolated in that here we are making a major scientific decision without the type of independent validation. If we were testing a drug, there would be an authority telling us how do we validate what it is. We have got no independent validation. The few reports we've had done have been released in a highly secretive way, and we have not had any opportunity to interact with the people that produced them. So I guess that's now what I'd like to do is introduce the panel, who are the ones that really know their stuff, and that central theme, although they're talking about different things, will all come out, which is that sense of fitness for purpose. And they're all well described in the FONS document, but I'll first introduce Richard. Let's first start with Richard Arnold. Thank you, Richard.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your welcome, Len. So I'm a professor of stats and data science at Vic. I've been there about 25 years, but before that I was at Stats New Zealand for a couple of years in the methodology area. Are you wanting to go right around the panel quickly now, Len, or shall I just carry on with my talk? Just carry on. Okay, well, so I wasn't able to be at the first panel, but I watched the recording with great interest. And I think a lot of the points that were made there remain true, that we haven't heard anything to change our views that the government is barreling ahead with this idea. So I don't know how effective we can be about diverting the ship. But what is clear to me is that Stats New Zealand needs assistance, expert assistance and advice, and as Len says, external validation of its approaches. So we can, on the limited resources that Stats New Zealand has, you can see that there are reports which have done the variable by variable look at the contents of the census and trying to map them. But they did come back with the initially bleak conclusion that only half of the variables in the census could be met by admin data. And if even with that, there still needs to be some game upping across the sector in the admin data collection. We still have the problem of timeliness of admin data, uniformity of standards across the admin data collections. But to speak briefly about information needs, the variables that don't that can't be collected through admin data are the most dynamic ones, the most private ones like sexual identity, religious affiliation, and so on, and the household variables, especially housing conditions. And the proposal for the census attribute survey isn't going to give us the sampling errors that we would want to have for small population groups. So the outlook really does look bleak for small, dynamic, and vulnerable populations. Or the populations that move a lot, young people, deprived people, that really is, there needs to be an approach that's going to capture that better. And I can't see the census attribute survey is going to easily be able to do that. So a few points about that. If it's going to do any kind of job, picking up these additional variables, it needs a decent sample size. And I really worry that this survey would be victim to the irresistible attraction to cut it or to reduce it or to limit its scope. And it will be one of the easy things to cut. And if it is 5% of dwellings, I guess that's double the size of the HLFS. And if that's the case, then the only practical way to run it would be as in a rolling week by week part of the sample, and the way that the HLFS does, bagging up every 13 weeks, or the New Zealand Health Survey bagging up annually. But that really, as a side point, raises questions about the use, about te kupinga and the disability survey. The reason, of course, that the census was used as a frame for those surveys is the rapidity with which New Zealanders move, and also the fact that there's no decent frame. So that also, it would seem to me, would have to convert those surveys into rolling surveys as well. And there's a methodological question there about the value of point-in-time estimates. You won't be able to get point-in-time estimates even for those important post-census surveys. Likewise, the discussion I've read about the census attribute surveys hasn't put much emphasis on institutions, non-private dwellings, and those other kind of non-standard ways that you could say that people are living in, multiple household dwellings. But particularly thinking about the institutions, I'm really concerned that there isn't some proposal for coverage of the things that the census covers that household surveys just typically say that's too hard, we're not doing it. So distant mesh blocks is one, of course, but institutions and these non-private dwellings. So I'm concerned that we really are going to have a permanent reduction in data quality as a result for those dynamic variables, for those household-related variables. Another point is the census attribute survey is as a survey, we'd want to calibrate it. And of course, what we always used to do to calibrate household surveys and still do is use population statistics derived from the census. And with that gone, we lose an important separate sense of validation. I know there will be methodological ways to approach that, but that's something of a concern for me as well. I know that time is short, so I won't make too many points, but the optimism that Stats New Zealand has about its modelling capacity, I mean, it's great to see the energy that people like Patrick Graham are putting into these dual frame approaches and methodologies for estimating missing data. But the problem is that those modelling approaches are very good at large scale, but they are always weak at small scale. And is again that small scale and those dynamic vulnerable populations where those are going to be the very weakest. So in a sense, if I think about the idea that maybe we're not going to be able to turn this ship around, my question for myself and for this group is, of course, what is our best way of ensuring that Stats New Zealand is adequately supported, validated, and is not left to the analysts who are in good faith working on these projects are not left to do an impossible job. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. If I can add to your point on surveys, one of the reasons why we put more data in our census is New Zealand politicians are mean about running statistical surveys. The idea that they might reverse that is a really interesting one, but not believable. But the next speaker is Peter Crampton. Nice to have you on the end there, Peter.
Thank you very much, Len. Kia ora koutou katoa. Yeah, my name is Peter Crampton. I am a public health academic at the University of Otago based in Dunedin. My disciplinary background is public health, but I work in the context of Haora Māori. Thank you for this opportunity. I've got 3 points to make, Len. I'm speaking on behalf of the NZDEP team, and our members are Claire Salmon, June Atkinson, myself, Helen Viggers, and Kura Lacey. I'm going to speak to your topic, but my comments are very much tailored to the purpose and function of NZDEP. And for those who are not familiar, NZDEP is a small area measure of relative socioeconomic deprivation. It's a widely used policy tool, advocacy tool, and planning tool, and has been used for around 3 decades now. It's embedded in the policy and institutional landscape. It's a measure of poverty, essentially, used extensively for resource allocation and other purposes. Now, bear with me. I'm going to share my screen because I've got 3 points to make, and in order to be clear about those 3 points, I'm going to show you some slides. So my first point is, speaking to the topic of the day, Len, is survey data are of no real use to us from the point of view of constructing a small area index of relative socioeconomic deprivation. And this is my single most important point, I think. One of the consequences of this point of survey data being no real use to us picks up on the previous speaker actually a little bit, and that is that the most marginalized communities will become less visible in official statistics and therefore probably more marginalized as a result of the decisions which have been taken in respect of the census, and less visible in tools used for planning, resource allocation, developing policies to meet the needs of those most in need. My second point is that dwelling and household or family enumeration data are very important for NZDEP. They're essential for 6 of the current NZDEP variables. And I can, later on, if anybody wants to ask which those 6 are and so on, I'm happy to elaborate on that. Currently, dwelling and household data are not available in the APC, the Administrative Population Census, or the IDI. And we argue that the allocation of people to addresses is a very high priority and must be as accurate as possible with continual quality checking. We also know that it's likely these data will be worse for people who move most often, and a good proportion of those will be in the most marginalized part of our communities. So that was point number 2. Point number 3 is a recommendation, and this speaks to comments which have already been made. We recommend that a full enumeration census, i.e. a traditional census, should be retained unless and until the admin first census is demonstrably able to deliver data of similar quality. We believe that from the point of view of resource allocation, planning, community level advocacy, research, we are willfully putting on a blindfold, which will disadvantage those who are already most disadvantaged. In particular, in order to achieve our recommendation, a huge amount of work is required in a number of domains before we have anything approaching the quality that is required for a tool such as NZDEP. We cannot currently recreate NZDEP from the IDI or the APC. We will create, and we are working hard on this, the best possible version of NZDEP based on the APC and IDI. That is work that is currently underway. So finally, I know the topic of this seminar is survey data. It's of no use to us. It's of no use to anyone who wants to understand the realities on the ground of communities in in the wider diversity of contexts that exist and at small geographies. Survey data will not deliver on that. And I shudder to think how territorial local authorities, local planners, service planners, etc., are going to plan their services in the absence of high quality data applying to small geographies. And lastly, as I said, my most important point, as a consequence of this, the most marginalized communities will become less visible in official statistics and will thereby become more marginalized as a result of the decision that has been taken to advance an APC before we should be, in our view, the NZDEP team. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and very happy to elaborate or take questions later on. But those are my key points. Len, thank you very much, everybody. And lovely to be here with you and lovely to see you all on the screen.
Thank you very, very much, Peter. That was abundantly clear. I'd now like to introduce Alistair Gray. Alistair, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Len. I have had a long association with Statistics New Zealand and designing surveys. I just would like to share my screen from slides. Whoa. Yeah. Can everyone see that? So Len asked me to think about some methodological issues. And I think one of the things that we forget is how do we create classifications? And I think a good example would be ethnicity and the development of this rather hodgepodge class called MILA. And the reason that that was developed is because of the increasing number of people who are reporting their ethnicity from Middle East, Latin American and African countries. How will we increase or improve iwi classification? I think occupation is another one. For example, ACC doesn't have a code for a statistician, and I wondered if they thought that was because there's no risk of a type 2 error in the workplace. Family type is another example of the increasingly diverse way that people create families, blended families, thruples, all these sorts of things. And indeed, the living arrangement, is it a two-family household, etc., etc. The other thing that's useful, I think, in terms of census information is how we monitor changes in self-identification, which is a feedback to classifications. I mean, the most obvious one is ethnicity, where since the 1986 census through intercensal studies, we've been able to look at changes in self-identification, ethnicity, gender, probably religion, those sorts of things. I mean, the most interesting study I can think of was when Stats New Zealand introduced the New Zealander category to ethnicity, and that had a major impact on how people reported their ethnicity, and there were major changes between the 2001 and 6 census. Now, clearly, with the introduction of sexual orientation in the census, we've got a chance to look at that kind of development. Do people change their sexual orientation at particular points through their life, through events that have happened, etc.? The other thing I wanted to remind people is that what sort of quality framework is being used. The traditional sort of thing that official statisticians have come up with are things like accuracy, relevance, timeliness. One of the things is since the 2018 census, information is much slower. Information at the small area unit is much slower in coming about. That's a big change because the previous censuses were information was much more readily available more frequently. We don't even know really, because there's no peer review, is what's the coherence? Are these methods consistent with other accepted practices? And as Len pointed out right early, New Zealand is somewhat isolated in terms of what I would call the Anglo-Saxon statistical community. And I think one of the key things that Peter's raised is the information at the user's level of disaggregation. Is it available? Are there costs to this? It's, I mean, one of the interesting things has been the shift to only have publicly available, without asking, information at the SA1 level rather than at the mesh block level. And finally, there's interpretability. I wonder if we are getting reliable estimates about these estimates that are produced from the administrative census. And on that note, the next slide is, I think, quite an interesting thing. Will there be a different emphasis on reliability measures? I mean, traditionally in the census, we looked at things like undercount, overcount of statistics, percentage of item non-response. Recently, well, since the 2018 census, there's been quality ratings of items. And how is that rating estimated? It's not clear in the documentation I've read, but I think it must be a misclassification rate. But this is the sort of table that gets produced now on reliability of a variable collected. This one is the source of census night address. And apparently the census response has a rating of 1, but it's not clear to me whether that's taken into account, undercount, overcount, the fact that the address has been assigned to the wrong mesh block, etc., etc. And it seems strange to me that it would be 1. The administrative data, is that a misclassification of addresses, or how reliable is if I've got an address that's been stable over 10 years, is that better than an address that's changing every month? And then we've got the modelling, and that presumably is something like a misclassification rate. And then we get the magic weighted total, and it's 0.97, and that's apparently very good. But why? That seems quite like, if we were thinking of an under coverage sort of notion, 3% on a census seems quite an error. Finally, I just want to say something following on from Richard about the lack of input from outside of what the attribute survey is going to be. And I think I want to remind people that the original motivation about 15 years ago, when Stat started to think about this, was the American Community Survey. And people must remember that that was designed to replace the decennial census long form, which in any case wasn't given to everybody. So it may have a quite different, or at least the thing we're building on may have a very different objective to what we're doing or want to do in the census attribute survey. And so obvious questions that I don't think get answered and what I've read is this an enhanced post-enumeration survey where we're looking at quality of estimates, estimates of undercount, overcount of individuals, and particularly of household types, and what's the quality of the address frame? So it seems to me there's a whole lot of design issues that in the documents I saw on the website skirted over, and certainly it looks more like a PR document than something that I would expect from a methodology division. It's got things like we need to ask, we have to have an independent address frame, and we have to enumerate inside our primary sampling units. The stratification has to be very fine, probably even finer than what I'm suggesting. And obviously the allocation will be much away from proportional to probably more equal sizes because we want small area information. But then there's the question is, should it be for proportional to the census missing? So if I know that I've got under coverage in a particular primary sampling unit, should that have a higher probability of being sampled? And the classic balance between and within PSU sampling. Normally, as statisticians, we only want to take a subsample, but maybe when we're thinking about the objectives of filling in gaps, a full coverage within a PSU might actually make a lot more sense. Finally, I just think the sample size is clearly being whittled down for cost reasons, not from any real design reasons, and it's a sort of post hoc justification of the sample size. I mean, currently they're suggesting, I think, 60,000 dwellings, although they talk about households, from 1.8 million, which less than a decade or so ago, the talk when it was first mentioned of having a census attribute survey was at least 100,000 from 1.6 million. So that's a radical reduction in size. And then the final thing is the 60,000 dwellings is clearly, I think, the initial sample size, but what's the achieved sample size? So what's the response rate that we think will be tolerable? Remember that in the household surveys that Stats run, that even in the labour force survey is not particularly high, about 80%, I think, when I last looked. But more worrying is, will they allow proxy rates? In a sense, in the census, we don't mostly have proxy fill-in of forms. People fill in their own form. So in the labour force survey, currently, I think the proxy rate's about 40%. So are we going to allow or think that that's reasonable? So I think there's a whole lot of issues, methodological issues, that ought to be discussed before this sort of attribute survey is in fact implemented in the field. So sorry, that's my rant for the day, and I hope that it's raised some thoughts.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Just to add to the worry about the loss of statistician information, you'll appreciate that with the tax department now making the completion of an annual tax return not necessary if they've got enough information from you, then we won't know the occupation not only of statisticians, but of anyone else, except those that fill in a tax return. Then after Stephen Hazlitt, who's going to speak next, then Andrew Spall will go after that. We're going to change the order briefly. Steve, welcome. You haven't got your microphone on yet.
Sorry about that. Yeah, is that better? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is that a yes?
Yep.
It's a yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, apologies. So my background is I'm an emeritus professor of statistics, and I like Alistair and Richard, I worked at Stats New Zealand once before I drifted into academia, and I think that that sort of background has served me very well. I think that the other thing that's probably important in my presentation is that I've done a lot of work on small area estimation, mostly for the United Nations, and particularly the World Food Programme. And I think that it may be that this is trotted out as the answer to some of the problems with this administrative census. And if it is, please disbelieve. All right, I'll get onto a little more detail. I think using admin data, no matter how comprehensive, requires that any combination used is to form this database is complete. So you need to not miss out small groups. When different sources are combined to get that coverage, the variables need to be compatible, and they're often not. Don't run under equivalent definitions. And there needs to be good linkage to allow matching of records. But the point about many of these administrative databases is that they're essentially transactional, many of them, and quality is maintained at best only for the components essential for the transactions. So what you tend to find is stuff like ethnicity is very poorly noted because, after all, they're trying to fix a broken arm or whatever. It's not part of the information that's required for the treatment. I'll skip that slide. The The proposed data collection and content for the census discussion document is available. It said that 40 of the 50 questions could be answered via administrative data and surveys, but which variables and how is not yet clear. I hope this isn't too small. I've gone through the document. There's no methodological details. There's no survey design for the census attribute survey or recognition of the issue that you raised, Alistair, in the first panel discussion about household definition. This passing mention of pooling of 5 years' data, it hasn't worked particularly well for the American survey, and it's always very clear, American Community Survey. And it's also rather unclear what it means to pool data over 5 years. What's the period to which this applies? And for things that are changing, it's obviously not going to work well. There is some points made, there's some problems recognised. Proposed data, there's no indication of which method will be used to integrate or the model used to combine survey and various admin sources to improve accuracy, and no recognition that the data linkage can severely bias analysis results. So I'm not going to go into these in detail, but there are various methods for combining data sources, particularly administrative databases or censuses, which we don't have, with a survey. And I'm not going to talk about these in detail, but I am going to show a slide that sort of outlines what the issues are. If you look here, you'll see in the column that's got blue, there's a few survey data results. And then if you look for the information that comes from the admin data in that slightly brownish orange color, pieces of data that are missing. So what a lot of these techniques are trying to do is to construct the equivalent, I use that word advisedly, the equivalent of a census by filling in the gaps. And you can see there's a lot of blue to fill in, and there's a lot of orange to fill in. And in this diagram, I mean, there's far more. If you're looking at 60,000 out of 1.8 million, you can see there's going to be a lot more blue than there is in my diagram. Now, there's a lot of these techniques, and what we're going to find, I think, is Stats New Zealand are going to start talking about them as though they're the answer to everything. All I want to make the point is that they're not. Some are better than others, but none of them are going to solve the real problem. And the risk possibly is that they're used to produce a single census, well, pseudo-census I call it, which is then used to create, as though it's a census, to create statistics that Stats New Zealand then publish. Very unwise. These sort of one-off production of these pseudo-censuses is extremely inaccurate. Would you please register? Extremely inaccurate, which is why in these techniques, this pseudo-census or these pseudo-censuses are produced many, 10,000 of them, and then we average. But it's not what they're planning to do, and they don't have a model. And the data they're using is not adequate. The stuff I've used has actually been a real census with a real survey and producing the other things that are in the survey but not in the census. So this is not a solution really to the problem. I'm not going to talk about those. Over there. 60,000 people. It's difficult to understand at this stage how the survey and the admin data can be well integrated. The survey will almost certainly be a stratified cluster design, and how that's going to be matched, I have no idea. Address? Well, obviously there are problems. Family? Well, obviously that's an issue as well. There are no international precedents for the New Zealand new census. None. And Len's made that point. We're out on our own, folks. And it hasn't been researched. I think you'll comment, Len, about trying mass producing and administering drugs before they've actually been gone through clinical trials. That's what we're planning to do. I really can't see how this can end well. Try to skip that slide. I went through and did a little bit of some calculations, and maybe I've got a few things wrong. I mean, their claim that Stats New Zealand's claim is at the top of this slide. They're looking at a 3% sample a year, around 60,000 households. So even with this iwi with 18,000 members, it'll give a sample of about 540 or 220 households. And if we were doing proportional sampling, the census attribute survey would give a full response rate of 100%, which it won't achieve. This would give a standard error of around 3.4% for a proportion for the household level variables. And with a stratified cluster design effects around 3 are common. Even with 100% response, we're looking at 95% confidence interval, half width of 11%. So your estimate plus or minus 11%. So that's for the iwi. So clearly we're not going to get any small area or small group statistics out of this. It's insufficiently accurate to be useful. And as I've said, combining data over 5 years isn't going to help much. It makes the sample size look larger, but it's completely unclear what period the data apply to. Now, I listened, and so did Alistair, to a very recent 11th, I think it was, the seminar about blackout communities without vital data. This is the international context. This is the American Community Survey. They're worried in America about using the ACS because it's exactly the problems that were outlined so clearly by Peter are exactly the problems they're having already. So, have Stats New Zealand claim this is the solution to everything is again nonsense. So I'd like to see an external technical assessment of Stats New Zealand's plans for this new census. I use those words advisedly. It needs an external technical methodological assessment of their plans. And currently the documents they're providing, as somebody pointed out, are PR. So conclusions, small area estimation or something similar is almost certainly what Stats New Zealand will need to do if they want to integrate their survey with administrative data to get accurate statistics, but I don't fancy their chances. They'll also need to call their new census official statistics, and this has been a major issue that I've been confronted with in a project in Indonesia recently. I mean, the idea of calling it official statistics doesn't make it better. It's putting a rubber stamp on it. Even if it's a New Zealand survey started immediately, met all its design and implementation criteria, and the administrative data source had excellent coverage and linkage, none of which are true, there are no international precedents. What is available for the task and how to model New Zealand statistically, the New Zealand data statistically, if it comes from this pseudo census, I open questions. And then there's issues about having to wait years, even if it were possible to combine data across 5 years. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you. It's one point we often forget that the census of dwellings is actually the one time in a 5-year period when we have the best available statistical frame of New Zealand. And in the last 2 censuses, we've completely forgotten that we invested in the census of dwellings as a statistical exercise to create the best frame that we possibly could, that was impossible to obtain from anyone else's address list or anything else in government. So our next speaker is Andrew Spall. Tēnā koe, Andrew.
Kia ora, Len. Kia ora huma koutou. Ko Andrew Spall toku ingoa, Uri Ahau and Ngāti Apa Rangatani me te Raroa. This is the almost 35th year that I've been a user of official statistics. And in doing that, I want to use that as my approach. I don't have the technical skills of the former speakers, but I am, for my sins, a prolonged user of official statistics. So I want to give a user's perspective about what's going on. Because this isn't just a technical exercise. It's very much about how do we produce official statistics information that is reliable, easily understood, and actually useful to a diversity of audiences. And I want to do that using 2 examples. One is building on what has already been mentioned by Peter and Alistair and Steve with regards to local data, and another one talking specifically about Māori and ethnic data. So, and I think one of the terrifying things for me is that we've already forgotten the lessons of COVID. we've already forgotten that local data is really, really important, because that's where, as the cliche goes, the rubber hits the road with the delivery of services, especially in a crisis. And we know that already the quality of information that was derived from admin data that was used to inform the vaccination rollout was wrong. It was inaccurate, and in a way that led to inequitable impacts on Māori, Pacific and rural populations. Like in our calculations that my team at Insight Analytics has done, we never actually hit 80% coverage of Māori vaccination rates in all regions. In fact, in some regions, it was significantly much less than that. And that has is really serious health implications for, especially with, diseases like COVID that can actually kill. So for me, it's about how can we use these, can the new approach, which is being promulgated, actually make sure that we can produce local information, that it's good enough quality, that it's accessible, and it's understandable. And if we're starting to talk about the error margins, the confidence intervals that Steve was mentioning, plus or minus 11%, at a local level, especially when you're talking about subpopulations at a local level, like how many people to vaccinate, that's starting to end up in garbage territory really, really quickly. So what we're doing is we're moving away from an information system that can actually inform local intervention. And that's particularly important in a crisis, but it's also disempowering to those local communities, because one of the things about a census is that it had very good coverage, and high levels of accuracy, even with just basic demographics, is that provided an information source for the collection of local information. So have we got good coverage? Right? Have we got a representative sample of our local population? If we haven't, can we reweight what we've created to make it look like our local population? So in doing that, we're actually not only not producing local information, we're crippling our ability to produce it later on, but by other means. The other thing and that's particularly important for subpopulations. So if you want to make sure, if you want to look at who got absolutely hammered by COVID, it's the very populations we had low quality information about. Right? Especially the disabled population, especially the Māori population, especially the Pacific population. If we'd known with that second outbreak that was a Cook Island specific, started in the Cook Island community, we could have got ahead of it really, really quick. Similarly with some of the regional outbreaks, we won't actually have a census system, if this proposal continues, that can actually be used to produce reliable resources, information resources in a crisis, that we can manage those kind of local outbreaks or amongst particular subpopulations. And that what we're doing then is we're creating a information system that is much more centralized. And in doing so, we're disempowering those local populations. We're disempowering populations, as Peter said, with the most deleterious impact of certain conditions, the hardest hit, and we're disempowering local action. The other thing I want to mention is regards to Māori data. It is an extreme concern to me that we will lose our only source of robust Māori descent information. Why? Because if you look at our international commitments to UNDRIP, UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what that says is that Indigenous peoples need the right to identify themselves. Whakapapa-based identity measures for Māori are our way of identifying as Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa. We won't have robust information on that. There are snippets in places, but we're already relying on, in order to create the APC that it currently exists, on data that's from 2013. So we won't have good quality sources for Māori descent data, let alone iwi data. Now, I'm going to park and not address the issue with regards to should the Crown hold iwi data. That's a discussion for the Kahui Raranga and the iwi Chairs Forum. But what it does do is has very serious political implications, because the Māori descent variable is the basis for calculating the Māori electoral population, which is the basis for determining how many Māori seats there are. And if you wind back both the data collection and the process of collecting Māori descent information from the 2013 and 2018 censuses, it could be argued from as early as 2013, we should have had another Māori electorate. That is important. That is important to our democracy, and we're going to be blind to that. We're going to be creating a much less defined, much less robust, but most importantly, because this is about civics, much less understandable way of determining how many Māori electorates there are going to be in New Zealand. So the other issue is with regards to electoral populations, ethnic populations. Now, we already know that detailed level 2 and beyond Pacific ethnicities have quite reasonably different demographics, quite different geographic locations, quite different social and health outcomes, and quite different sort of life course directions. Again, we were going to be blind on that. There is no way a survey can collect that level of information about those small populations, right, in ways that actually empowers them. So given that we're dealing with, at least with our 3 realm countries, we're going to be negating our obligation to those realm countries at the very least. But we will be blind to the nature and the needs of those particular Pacific populations as well. So what we're seeing is a solution that's becoming much more technical, a hell of a lot less accessible, and a hell of a lot less understandable. And for me, what this means is that we're heading towards an approach that suits Wellington, but that one size fits all approach doesn't actually work for everybody. And what it will do is that consolidation of information means that will reinforce the consolidation of decision-making that COVID showed us was that one of the drivers of the extreme regional and ethnic inequality we saw in COVID outcomes. And we're talking deaths, right? We're talking hospitalizations. We're talking major harm to families. We're talking about prolonged lockdowns and economic impacts. And so that distancing of a population from high quality information about themselves, we should be really concerned about, because, the census is more than just an exercise in producing useful, high quality research information. It's also about an exercise in civics, where and so when we're not delivering to those communities that we know that are not large scale, that are rural, right, or have high needs, and yet we're producing information about them, we do that in a prolonged way, and that begins to look like surveillance. And so we're actually moving from an exercise that used to build trust in civic and civic engagement to something that's actually undermining it. And I think we should be really concerned about it. And I think we should be concerned about it to, yes, start criticising the technical limitations of what's being proposed, but I think we should also be thinking ahead of the game and start producing what it should look like when all of this inevitably falls apart. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you've given us a very strong reminder that if the methodologists don't do due diligence, they give politicians the need to make decisions without themselves doing due diligence on our behalf. And the ultimate issue is, if this is immensely important, like in the judicial area, then methodological issues are at risk of being fought out in a judicial environment rather than in the professional statistical environment that is the proper place for them to be discussed. And I think you've provided a very thoughtful and demanding reminder Andrew, of that we statisticians, as any scientist, we've got an obligation to ensure that our own methodology, our own science is itself robust before we expect other people to rely on it. Right, well, the next speaker is Kylie. I must admit, I heard Kylie talk at the demography conference on environmental health, and I thought, my God, we have missed the plot here. There's so much here that we need to understand. So Kylie, thank you very much.
Kia ora koutou. I'm a principal analyst in the EHINZ team. I've got a background in sample surveys using administrative health data sets and census data. And so today I thought I'd talk briefly about some of the uses at the local level of census data and the potential impacts of the census changes. So in particular, in our group, we've several years ago, we developed a set of social vulnerability indicators for flooding, and they're also useful for a range of natural hazards and climate-related hazards. And for our case study of Porirua, our stakeholder group, which included health experts and public health unit, the DHB, primary health organisation, the local council, local iwi, local civil defence emergency management group, they all were very, very clear that they needed as fine a geographic resolution of data as possible. So data about neighbourhoods, ideally about streets if they could, and that DHB level and local council level data was just not going to cut it for them. And they needed information about people, the number of people, but also about population subgroups and about characteristics of the population that might relate to their vulnerability or their resilience, or might show that they have specific needs that needed to be addressed. And so local level data is really important for emergency management, for local councils and understanding the local population and their needs, for climate change adaptation, and for public health issues such as improving housing quality. So for our social vulnerability indicators, we obviously use census data. It is the obvious choice. It's got really fine geographic level data, a range of topics, and it's often the only source of information about a topic. And our indicators have been used in a number of different floods and disasters to provide evidence during a response phase. So I've looked at our 2023 list of indicators from the 2023 census, and there are several impacts from the change in census. So firstly, and it's just, this is all picking up on all the other points that all the other amazing speakers have talked about. So many of the topics that we use will not be available through admin data. And so some of the obvious examples, by no means a full list. So NZDEP, people with functional limitations, so mobility issues, vision problems, languages such as people who don't speak English, households with no mobile phone, no access to the internet, households with no car, damp and mouldy dwellings, dwellings with no access to basic amenities such as safe running water, fridge, power, severe housing deprivation and homelessness. And there's others as well where the admin data is not great and is not necessarily fit for purpose either. So therefore for this kind of information, we will be relying on this sample survey, and this will have negative implications. So primarily for local level data, if we want SA2 level data, we will be struggling with sample size issues, I'm sure. It will be quite difficult to get sufficient sample size, I'd say. We'll probably be relying on pooling data over time. And then what does that mean when you have lots of people shifting in and out of an area? We're likely to get suppressed values for a lot of areas where the population is small or the sample size is not sufficient. Even if we can get estimates, we're likely to have quite wide confidence intervals. And suddenly that means, well, what does it really mean if you've got an estimate plus or minus 10 or 20%? Is that actually useful for anyone's needs? There won't be data for SA1 for the smaller geographic area. So for rural areas where SA2s cover a really large area, it's not going to be that informative when we're thinking about actual hazard zones, for example, or smaller communities. And also the sample survey frame, I believe, excludes some people, potentially, so those living in camping grounds and other sort of more vulnerable people. And you have the complexity of suddenly you don't have a census, you have survey data, which comes with sampling errors and RSEs and confidence intervals and trying to convey that to the population. And I realised that Stats New Zealand might use a combined approach of combining admin and survey data such as how Steve's described, but we're still modelling. We're still getting a best guess from my understanding of it, which, is not going to really meet the needs necessarily. And also surveys are just not the best method for picking up on things that have a low prevalence. So if we're actually wanting to know about these kinds of issues in small geographic areas, we're really going to struggle to measure it with a sample survey. And again, also for population subgroups. If you want to know about, say, Māori in a specific area, that will be tricky due to sample size issues. So I was at the New Zealand Population Conference, and Stats New Zealand did do a few presentations on this new approach. And what I took away from it, my impression was that they say that they have a lot to get through. There's a lot of issues that they need to sort out, that they have plans in place, but it seemed to rely on a lot of work still to be done in the next few years to try and sort out methods. And so in summary, I have a lot of concerns about this approach. I don't think that survey data is going to be fit for purpose for local communities and for understanding their needs. And that ultimately it will be less information for communities, poorer understanding of local needs and potential risk from climate-related hazards, natural hazards, and other issues. And ultimately, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. So yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kylie. Our final speaker is Barry Milne, who's bravely lasted to the end. Barry, your spot.
Kia ora, Ken. Kia ora koutou. Ka Barry Milne aho. He harangi aho ki Waipapata Mararau. So I'm Barry Milne. I'm a professor of quantitative social science at the University of Auckland. Haven't worked as long on census on official statistics as Andrew has, but I have been working with census data for the last 17 years or so, and also with admin data as well. And what I thought I'd focus on here, which other people have done as well, is go through the methods that Stats New Zealand have proposed as I understand them. And that's based on two things: the documentation that they've produced, and also I was lucky enough to meet with Stats New Zealand on Monday, where I chewed their ear off asking them questions about their methodology. So I'll just go through some of the things I've learned and some of the things that have sort of cropped up in my mind, issues. They're going to rely on three sources of data: admin data, the census attribute survey, and also tailored solutions. And I'll start with the tailored solutions one, mainly because I don't have much to say, and that is, it's unclear how they're going to work and whether they're going to adhere to any statistical standard at all. Tailored solutions they raise as an issue because they think they can't do everything with the other two ones, which is the admin data and the census attribute survey. On the admin data, what I found out by talking to them is that they've set up something called the directives program, where Stats New Zealand and other agencies from whom they are going to be requesting data, administrative data, will get together and Stats New Zealand will direct them how to collect data in a way that is consistent and in line with the census attributes that they've been collecting using census methods over time. My first thought when I heard this is, well, this sounds pretty ambitious, and ultimately it's going to have to flow through to the service end. So the people who collect the data are not the people who are going to be in the room discussing the directives program. It's people out there giving services to people, and their job, as is made by another speaker as well, is to provide a service, not to collect data. So how that flows through to the thousands of people, that's what we're doing. We're outsourcing our data collection to thousands of people who are providing services to people. Another implication of that, it's kind of turning Stats New Zealand into a data czar, where they can tell other agencies how they go and do their job. And I don't know how that's going to go down after a while. And the third thing, and this was raised by a colleague of mine, Natalia Boven, is that this has resource implications for the other agencies, which I don't think has been factored in when the talk has been about saving money by doing census a different way. I think there's also talk of directing agencies to collect data that they don't currently collect. It's been mentioned, for instance, about getting Inland Revenue to collect data on occupation. And also, it was mentioned, getting Customs to collect data on Māori descent on the kind of the cards that you fill out when you come into the country. And one of the reasons for doing so is I pointed out to them that the Māori descent data in the administrative population census is missing for 14% of people. And they said, well, a lot of those are people who were born overseas, and maybe we can get it from customs data. And then I said, well, you know, you have to be careful of the Privacy Act then, because agencies shouldn't be collecting data unless it's part of the function of that agency. And I can't quite see that the function of the customs system is to collect information, or what the value, why they would need to collect information on Māori descent. It also may involve ingesting more data into Stats New Zealand admin system. And they did use and did get an agreement to use from the Electoral Commission the electoral data to fill in some Māori descent information at the 2023 census. There was talk of using that more widely, which I think raises huge social license issues. And Stats New Zealand might have to do social license properly this time and tell the whole country what they're doing with their data. If you are handing over your data to Stats New Zealand just by enrolling to vote, that seems a huge social license issue to me. In terms of the Census Attribute Survey, my understanding is that they aim to maintain an up-to-date dwelling register, which will use information they've got currently and will be augmented from data from Land Information New Zealand to have an ongoing up-to-date list of all the dwellings in New Zealand. And so I said, well, you know, how do you know it's accurate? What used to happen, I believe, and Len would know, with censuses, is census enumerators would wander around the areas they were supposed to go to, and they'd see where a dwelling was there they didn't know about, and see where a dwelling they thought was there wasn't there. Is that going to happen? Is that what is happening right now when they're doing the trial of that survey, of the Census Attribute Survey? And just picking up another couple of points as well. So we found out, and I think I've got this correctly, and they can correct me if I get this wrong. It's going to be a simple random sample of households from that dwelling frame, or sample of dwellings from that dwelling frame. And they do use households and dwellings slightly interchangeably when they talk about things. With an achieved sample of 60,000. So they may not aim for 60,000, they may aim for more. This is what they say, at least. Where what they'll do is they'll treat that as if they were doing a census for those people. So they'll get a dwelling form and an individual form for each person in that household that they go to. And just thinking about, which again, this is all new to me. This wasn't clear from the documentation. And one thing I thought as well, a simple random sample of households. Do you really want to do it that way, or would you stratify by SA2 or something like that to make sure you get good information from every relatively small area in the country? As has been mentioned by others, they need to somehow include non-private dwellings. They do plan to do so. Apparently a working group is being developed to work out how to do this, but at the moment it's completely unclear how this is going to happen. And the last thing I'll say just about the Census Attribute Survey is a point that was made by Dick Bedford a couple of years ago when this first was being mooted after the 2023 census. He said, you know, New Zealanders over the last 150 years have got into the habit of filling out a census every 5 years. And there's big comms around it. Everyone knows they have to do it. They all do it at the same time. And by and large, they've done it. We did not so well the 2018, not so well the 2023 census. With the Census Attribute Survey, you may be asked to fill that out once or twice in a lifetime. Without, I would think, the same comms around everyone's doing this at the moment. At that point, what is your willingness going to be to complete that survey? It's just unclear. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I suppose I'll say one more thing, and that's just emphasizing Steve's point and Kylie's point about it's just unclear how they're going to merge all these three methods together to come up with an estimate. And when you've got 14% missing Māori descent data and a 3% population survey, I can't see how you can put those two things together to get a good estimate of using that example, Māori descent. Anyway, so I think there's quite a number of issues there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I must admit, we almost could have used an hour with each of you individually. And I think fortunately, this has been recorded, and this, I think, is going to be a wonderful resource to our friends in statistics and elsewhere in terms of this is a sort of discussion that ought to have happened a year ago, 2 years ago, but it's never too late. We'll now open the floor to questions to any of the speakers. I suspect we could probably be here all afternoon with such wonderful, but anyway, so Barry, you're looking after the questioners, and I'll shut up.
Patrick and I can, anybody that wants to ask a question of the panel or just generally open the discussion up, put your hand up or and we can give you speaking rights.
Barry, Dennis has his hand up.
Come, yeah, Dennis, yes.
Right, thanks, Barry. A very interesting session. Just before I only want to talk about quality, but before I do that, something Andrew said reminded me that the worst Australian census in modern times, at least, was the 1976 census, and that resulted in appeals to the High Court about the accuracy of the population estimates that were used for electoral purposes, and out of that, the ABS it was legislated to run a census every 5 years. So I guess it's not without question that if the census numbers are as poor as many as you think they will be, that there may be legal challenges at a very high level. Just before I make my comments on quality, not everyone in the audience will know me, but I just first of all would say that I've been involved in one way or another every Australian census since 1966. I was very young when I worked on that one, but and most recently I did a review for the ABS into their plans for the 2026 census in June this year. I also worked for 10 years doing quality audits for Statistics Sweden in combination with Paul Beamer, who many of you would have heard of from the Research Triangle Institute in United States. We heard some very convincing arguments today about the virtues of a place-based census compared with a person-based census, and I won't go over those arguments except to say that I fully support them. As part of my work in Sweden, we did an quality audit of their population register, which is a very mature, sophisticated population register. It's also people's registration is at the local level. It's not at the national level, so they can actually produce from their register statistics for small geographic areas. But one thing they can't do, despite many attempts, is produce household or dwelling statistics. They can't produce place-based data, and that's with a much more sophisticated population register than what I think the New Zealand IDI is. Now, assuming that you are running a person-based census, as far as I can see, there's been no thorough error analysis. Alistair mentioned undercoverage. That's potentially one issue. I've not seen any data on how many people are actually missing from the IDI administrative set, but you would think that would probably vary quite a bit by ethnicity and age group. But what's often forgotten is overcoverage. This, in fact, is the biggest problem in the Swedish population register. People who are on the register but no longer live in Sweden. They may be people who've migrated from New Zealand, perhaps temporarily, to Australia. They may be people who have died, but the registers haven't caught up with them. So overcoverage is something that really does need to be assessed. There's also duplication, the potential duplication in registers as people change addresses. They're not always consistent in the way they provide their names. Sometimes I know my daughter just uses her maiden name. Sometimes she uses her married name. So there may be duplication on the register that we don't know about. And there's other sorts of areas. I won't go into detail. Validity, many of you talked about, where the administrative data variable isn't exactly what you want from the census, and that, among other things, creates discontinuity with past data. There will be measurement errors in administrative data. It's not perfect. It could be due to poor form design or even deliberate misreporting. There'll be processing errors. I assume that there are going to be some coding, and in the ABS are using machine learning models. And as you all know, machine learning models aren't perfect, particularly if you've got a poor training data set. And there'll be non-response, missing data, and linkage errors. So as far as I can see, there's been no thorough analysis of the quality of what even a person-based census would be. Stats New Zealand are undertaking a huge risk, as Steve highlighted at the end of his comments. No one else has done a census like this. This would be the first. And even if they're successful in doing it, they won't be able to produce a number of high priority traditional census statistics, and they're doing that by design almost. The quality is uncertain, and I'm not even convinced the cost will be lower. When you look at the cost of a large survey, what is it, the attribute survey that they're talking about, combined with a census, it's not clear that the cost will be lower. And the most expensive New Zealand census by a long way was the one run in 2023. So just to summarise, I do think administrative data has a significant role to play in censuses, but to supplement a traditional census rather than provide the basis of a census. And the ABS has already moved in that direction. It's using administrative data in a number of ways, including improving its imputation processes for non-response. It's also started using some administrative data to support census variables, and sometimes in lieu of census variable income in particular, as well as a income question census, which doesn't really provide you a lot of detail. They're going to be adding tax-based income data to support census analysis. And they plan for the 2031 census to move even further in that direction. There still will be a traditional census, but looking at using even more administrative data in lieu of or to support census variables. And that will be in 2031. And New Zealand's, as I understand it, is now planning a 2030 census. So there is a real opportunity for Statistics New Zealand to leverage off the ABS in that development for 2030 census, because the ABS will be putting a lot of R&D effort into doing their 2031 census in a somewhat different way. And I liked Andrew's comment at the end of his remarks saying, what we need to do is describe what the census should look like, not just criticise what they're doing, but actually put forward an alternative that does recognise the increasing role that administrative data can play. Thank you.
Len, can I ask a question? And that is, we've talked about why the move to away from the census is a bad idea and not a good idea. What I'm still struggling to understand is what prompted the move away from the census. Was it purely a poor response rate? We needed to update that response rate, or the fact that Stats New Zealand spent 400 million and got a poor response rate? Was it a money issue, a poor response, or poor administration from Stats? Does anybody have an idea what, or we just need to do something different because England tried to do it?
I think there's a mix of things. One is that in 2018, Stats made what you might call an unforced error. They did not carry out the traditional enumeration of households before they carried out the census. They used the best address list they had, which was quite substandard, and it was compounded by the idea that people will fill in the forms if we post them a web link. And so really the failure in 2018 was and poorly analysed as such. You know, the external review of that failed to grasp the difference between non-contact and non-response. 2023, don't forget, the planning was based on a very poor understanding of what went wrong in 2018 and enthusiasm for the administrative data first mantra, which was there, and also an enthusiasm of the stats department, government statisticians, for social investment. And it's no accident, for example, that the new government statistician's job description has an obligation to support social investment. So what we have seen is the mindset of people that supporting social investment is probably one of the best things we can possibly do. And I think the fact the department has lost all its connections with major user groups, doesn't publish. I mean, we've got the most exciting demographic period. Maori and Pacific are going through the same demographic transformation that the European population went through in the 60s and 70s. And we're actually not going to have the same information that the government had when I was around to look at issues of housing and education that's relevant to that population. So we're actually sort of misunderstanding it and being able to, we're not thinking enough about that significant shift. The other thing, which is finally, the 2018 review was done by people that really didn't know much and compared to what they needed to. And it had a whole theme of everyone else is doing this, so let's get on with it. And the 2023 review at least had the honesty to say that our address frame for 2023 was even worse than what we used in 2018. But again, that mythical, if we only get 90% of the responses, which is what Cabinet expected, we can fill the rest up with administrative data. So 2023 was a bizarre model, and the fact it cost us at least twice as much per capita in real terms was a complete failure of the Treasury, the two Ministers of Finance, Grant Robertson and Nicola Willis, to worry about that. I used to make the point that Gordon Brown or Bill Birch or Ruth Richardson would have had my guts strewn around the street if I had told them that the 1996 census had just cost twice as much in real terms as anything we'd done in the previous 100 years. So you've had this mindset in Treasury and everywhere else that social investment is God's gift to the country. I don't even know what social investment is, but it's God's gift to the country, and therefore we're subverting a whole lot of other things for that. If you read the annual reports of the government statistician or briefings to minister, there's virtually no comment on the official statistics role. They are all about the data steward role and the ability to produce data. So we've not had a critical analysis from a government statistician for nearly 10 years of the effectiveness of the official statistics they're produced. So that's my summary, but I'm a little biased and sort of I don't see the job of a government statistician as being primarily a data warehouseman. I see it as a reporter on society, as all my predecessors did. And I think hopefully we'll get back to that one day, and that will change how we think about it. That was a bit long-winded, sorry.
Gosh. Is there any other questions for the panel or in general? Don't see any. Doesn't seem to be. Len, do you want to sum up?
Well, look, although there's not much questions, I think this has been a really extraordinary presentation of issues that spanned that whole issue of fitness for purpose. And I think they raise a set of, if we were to write now a job description for someone carry out an independent review, listening to this set of this webinar would provide them with a darn good way of creating a terms of reference. I think the point that was made by Andrew and others and Dennis is somehow or other we've got to turn this around. The user community has to play a big part, as it did in Britain, but we don't seem to have that same cohesiveness. In fact, can I just thank the panelists? It has been a remarkable mix of people and the insights. And just finally, thank you for yet again putting a neck out and running one of these. I just hope that future government statisticians will be comfortable in getting a dozen people like you in a room for a few hours without a tape recorder on or with one, and really start thinking about where we're going. My comment to Dr. Retty when I first met him was that you have been given a poisoned chalice. It didn't stop him making the decision, but it didn't do what I think a politician should have done, is said, you are asking me to make a really big decision. How can I independently give myself assurance that this is the right thing to do? Can I say it's a question that neither Dr. Retty, Andrew Bailey, David Clark, or Deborah Russell would have asked, because they have all been addicted to this same line of argument. This is not a party political thing. This is a failure of our political system, where we don't have politicians, unlike Britain, that have a decent set of basis for challenging the public sector. And so I see this as much a political problem as a methodological one, and a failing of the public service management.
We do actually have a couple of questions. One is from Brendan. A partial solution to understanding smaller populations, particularly smaller or rural Maori populations, was the federated data model with, for example, local ranga sharing clearing data. Would this work? That's one question. And Megan, would an individual be happy that the data they give essentially to the government being known to ruranga? Would this change their willingness to give it or be truthful? I don't know whether anybody's got any immediate thoughts on that. Just while people are pondering, we, in response to having 2 webinars, I did get some interest from Stats New Zealand to also have a webinar, and we're working on that. Their idea would be to say what they have done, decided or not decided, and where they're up to. So we'll keep you posted on that, further developments. Okay, this doesn't seem to be any other questions. Oh, yes, Michael. I can see. No. Just frantically waving. Thank you. Hey, well, thanks, Len, for chairing, and also thank to the panelists on behalf of the FONS committee. Once again, this is a role that we see FONS having independence and getting esteemed people to discuss major issues, and certainly the census is a major issue. So thank you to the panelists for giving up your time and your lunch to come along and give us your thoughts. Thanks to everybody that turned up. And have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.